If it's Thursday, Russia launches a new wave of airstrikes across Ukraine, knocking out power to major cities in one of the worst ever strikes on Ukraine's vital infrastructure. Plus, more countries now ordering coronavirus testing for travelers coming from China as cases there surge. But some experts warn the move won't prevent a spike in cases here at home. And federal prosecutors launch an investigation into embattled Congressman-elect George Santos as officials in the Republicans' home district conduct their own probe in his long list of lies, and calls for legal and political accountability mount on Capitol Hill and beyond. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker. We begin today with what appears to be the largest wave of Russian strikes on Ukraine in weeks. A barrage of missiles was launched at cities across Ukraine, the latest in a series of Russian attacks targeting the country's power stations and other critical infrastructure. Now, according to Ukraine's armed forces, the attack began with exploding drones, followed by 69 missiles, 54 of which were shot down. Multiple explosions rocked the capital city of Kyiv. Now, according to Kyiv's mayor, 40% of households in the capital city were without power earlier today. In the western city of Lviv, the mayor said that 90% of his city is without electricity and warned there may be interruptions to the city's water supply following today's missile strikes. And in Kharkiv, officials say all of the Russian missiles there were aimed at critical infrastructure. Take a look at this video from Kharkiv's fire chief showing emergency workers trying to put out a fire at an electricity station. Today's assault comes as any effort at peace talks appear to be stalled as we head into the new year. Russia is rejecting a proposal from Ukraine for a peace summit hosted by the United Nations under the condition that Moscow submit to a war crimes tribunal. Russia's foreign ministry is calling that proposal, quote, hollow and delirious. Moscow also said this week that there cannot be peace talks unless Ukraine gives up parts of its territory in the east that Russia partially occupies and illegally annexed over the course of the war. NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel looks back at how the war began and where things stand almost a year later. And we do want to warn you, some of the video may be disturbing.
In the twilight hours of February 24th, President Vladimir Putin took to Russian state television to announce a special military operation that aimed to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Minutes later, explosions rocked Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Missiles rained down across the country, and Russia's massive military moved across the border. Putin's special operation was clearly war. Although Putin had long denied his intentions to invade his neighbor, he'd openly claimed Ukraine was part of Russia and demonized Ukraine's leaders. Putin had already illegally annexed Ukrainian territory, the Crimean Peninsula, in 2014, with little international backlash. This time, condemnation came quickly.
Putin's choice to make a totally unjustifiable war on Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger.
Wide-ranging sanctions were rolled out, but they did little to deter. Russia's military, 10 times the size of Ukraine's, moved swiftly to surround Kyiv. But almost immediately, cracks in the mighty Russian army began to appear. Their advances stalled. The Ukrainians organized and fought back. Civilians banded together. Many took up arms to defend their country. It seemed Vladimir Putin hadn't accounted for this, the will of the Ukrainian people. Led by an unlikely hero, President Volodymyr Zelensky, the nation rallied behind the comedian turned politician, now wartime leader. Facing resistance and failing to capture Kyiv, Russia focused its attacks on eastern Ukraine. Moscow called it a change of strategy. For the Ukrainians, it was a major victory, but any celebrations were short-lived. As Russian forces withdrew from around Kyiv, evidence of atrocities and war crimes on a massive scale emerged. First in Bucha, the pattern would continue in other liberated areas. Ukrainian officials documented 50,000 alleged Russian war crimes.
Russia has repeatedly denied its soldiers are responsible.
Why do you think this is happening, that there are now thousands of allegations of Russian war crimes here? Thousands of them.
Something was, something was broken with mentality, with them.
In the east and in the south, Russia's bloody campaign continued, with Putin's forces firing missiles and artillery to hammer towns and cities, often indiscriminately. U.S. officials estimate tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians have been killed and 100,000 Russian troops killed or wounded. Ukrainians have soldiered on, backed by international support, including $20 billion in weapons and military assistance from the United States. Ukrainian troops have used it to launch a major counteroffensive, liberating large parts of eastern Ukraine. And then the southern city of Kherson, occupied by Moscow for 8 months. As the Ukrainian military moved in, soldiers were given a hero's welcome. President Zelensky called the liberation of Kherson the beginning of the end of this war.
How are you feeling today, Mr. President? How are you feeling?
Very well.
How is this moment for you?
The moment is very important. That is the biggest city what was occupied since 24th of February. So that is the biggest city, and now it's free. So Ukraine came, so I'm happy.
As the conflict nears 1 year, there's still no end in sight. Ukrainians fear the world is losing interest in the war as Putin employs a brutal new tactic, mass targeting Ukraine's infrastructure, just as temperatures plummet. He couldn't take Ukraine as completely or quickly as he'd hoped. Now it seems he's trying to starve and freeze the country into submission. Richard Engel, NBC News.
Just an extraordinary look back. Our thanks to Richard Engel for that. Joining me now is NBC News foreign correspondent Matt Bradley in Kyiv and former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor. Thanks so much to both of you for being here. Matt, I just want to start with you there. What has the reaction been on the ground to this latest barrage of attacks by Russia?
Well, Kristen, I can tell you that it's not a lot of surprise. President Zelensky had, said that this was going to happen. He said that there was likely to be an attack just ahead of the new year. And the fact of the matter is that these barrages have they haven't become sort of habit. People here aren't necessarily used to them. They're still horrifying. But a lot of people here, they recognize exactly what the Russians are going to be targeting, which is this electricity infrastructure, because they've been doing it time and time again. In many ways, the big surprise was the reprieve we've had over most of the past 2 weeks, when Vladimir Putin's military hasn't been targeting civilian targets beyond the battlefield like he had been in the fall and in the early winter. So now what we're starting to see are folks here, they are, they're kind of used to this. They understand what's going to be happening. You don't see the kind of panic that you might have seen earlier in the war. Now on the streets of Kyiv, when you hear the air raid sirens, people seem fairly relaxed.
What's incredible, Matt, is that to some extent they have adapted to these conditions. You heard Richard's report there that Vladimir Putin is trying to starve and freeze the people of Ukraine. They have found a way around this. How are you seeing them adapt to these really horrific, unthinkable circumstances?
Well, one of the things that the Ukrainian government has done is open up these invincibility centers, which is allowing for people to get access to electricity, hot water, things like that. And, a lot of people here, they're just moving along because these are not necessarily blackouts that are lasting or enduring for days and days. They're sort of rolling blackouts. So people are able to kind of time them. They're able to anticipate when their power will go out. And so they charge their phones. They know where to go. They have backup plans. People here, like I said, they're not used to it in the sense that it's habit, but or in the sense that it's sort of a cavalier attitude. But they understand what's going to happen because it's happened so many times in the past. The problem is that when it gets to the real depth of winter in the next month or two, the resources here that are already strained could be strained quite a bit more. But I have to tell you, walking around the city here, the shops, they're filled with products. The restaurants are still serving. There's still an 11 p.m. curfew every night, and we spoke with actually one of the top officials in the police of Kyiv just today. And I asked him, why is that curfew still persisting? And he said one of the main reasons is because there's a blackout on the streets. When you walk around on the streets, you can't even really see your feet in front of you because the street lights aren't on. And so they want to maintain, they want to keep people from looting. They want to keep criminality down when this city is still cloaked in darkness. But like I said, there's a certain calmness to all of that.
Matt Bradley, thank you so much for your reporting and for bringing really the resilience of the people of Ukraine to us. Ambassador Taylor, I want to turn to you now and get your reaction to this latest series of attacks by Russia. As Matt reports, the people of Ukraine are not surprised, but I guess broadly speaking, what do you make of them? The fact that Vladimir Putin is targeting infrastructure, the fact that he is trying to starve and freeze people, is it an indication essentially that militarily he's not as strong as he would like to be or needs to be?
Kristen, you're exactly right. He is desperate. He has found that his military is no match. His military gets beaten on the battlefield every time they come up against the Ukrainian military. Your report there, Richard Engel's report, was great in that it described how the Russians have been pushed out of Kyiv, pushed out of Kharkiv, pushed out of Kherson. So Vladimir Putin knows he can't win on the battlefield. So what's he doing? Exactly as Matt Bradley just described. He is attacking unarmed civilian targets, mainly the energy. And that's causing big problems for the Ukrainians. But again, as Matt has described, the Ukrainians are not giving up. They're resilient. They're figuring out ways to last. They'll make it through the winter. They'll make it through this horrible time. And they will, in the end, they're convinced, and I believe them, Kristen, they will win in the end.
Well, one of the things that the U.S. has most recently done, as you have been talking about, as we have been reporting on, is given Ukraine this Patriot missile system. I have seen your reaction. I've read it and heard you say it's an important step, but more needs to be done. Talk about what more you think specifically the U.S. and its allies need to do in terms of getting more advanced military to the people of Ukraine.
Yes, we need to get more to the Ukrainians so that they can win. They believe they can win. We can support them so that they will win, but we've not yet given them the range of weapons, the longer range weapons that the Ukrainians need to be able to go after the Russian targets deep in Ukrainian territory, in Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory. That's where the ammunition dumps are and the fuel depots and the military headquarters. That's where they are. They need to go there. If they're going to push the Russians out of their country, they need that longer range weapons. They also need to be able to fire back at any Russian military that targets them, whether it's in occupied Ukrainian territory or whether it's in Russia. So we've got some things that we can do to help them win.
And of course, the consistent argument by some within the Biden administration and those who are opposed to sending more robust military weaponry is that that would be seen as escalatory in the eyes of Vladimir Putin, that could potentially make this already horrific situation even worse. What do you make of that argument now, 11 months into this war, Ambassador?
Kristen, I think it's the reverse. I think if the Ukrainians are allowed to attack back when they are attacked out of Russian territory or out of Ukrainian territory that Russians, if they're allowed to attack back, that will de-escalate. That will be the way that the Ukrainians will bring this war to an end more quickly. If they are able to push the Russians back with these weapons, that will bring the war to an end much more quickly than if we hold our fire. And if we constrain ourselves on what we give to the Ukrainians, that will prolong it.
Republicans have said they don't want to write a so-called blank check to Ukraine. When you hear that type of language, does it make you think it's that much harder to not only get more advanced weaponry to Ukraine, but to continue the type of aid that we've been sending?
I don't think so. I think when you listen to the Republicans carefully, they say they want oversight. They want accountability. That's fine. Ukrainians want oversight and accountability. No one wants more than the Ukrainians for those weapons to get to the right place. So the accountability is fine. No one is asking for a blank check. What we are doing is President Zelensky has made this point. We are investing in our own security. This is an investment that we do. We want accountability, but the Ukrainians need it. The Republicans and the Democrats, bipartisan, have supported these kinds of support packages, both weapons and finance and humanitarian. In my view, Kristen, that's going to continue.
Ambassador, I wondered, finally, as we look toward 2023, if you can reflect on how you think this ends. You have Ukraine proposing a peace summit, but only under the conditions that Russia would submit to a war tribunal, something that is not going to happen. You have Russia saying, yes, we'll come to the table as long as you cede some of your territory. Ukraine is saying that's never going to happen. How does this end?
You, of course, have to look for options for peace. Negotiations will be a part of that, but I think this ends on the battlefield. I think this ends with Ukrainians continuing to do what they have been doing, which is winning on the battlefield, and in the Ukraine and the Russians doing what they have been doing, which is losing on the battlefield. So I think this is how it ends, and then the negotiations can begin.
Okay. Ambassador Bill Taylor, it is always so wonderful to have your perspective. I wish you a very wonderful new year, even as we continue to track the horror, the tragedy that is unfolding in Ukraine. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristen.
Coming up, preventing contagion. Less than 1/5 of all U.S. adults, less than 1/5 have received the updated COVID booster shot. What that means for efforts to prevent a post-holiday spike in infections, with a former top White House COVID advisor next. Plus, stranded travelers in some of the communities hit hardest by that historic deadly winter storm may finally be seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. We'll have more ahead. You're watching Meet the Press Now on this Thursday. Welcome back. The U.S. now joins Italy, Japan, Taiwan, and India in implementing testing requirements for travelers flying from China as that country faces a surge in COVID cases. U.S. officials say the decision was driven in part by a lack of transparency from China, specifically regarding the data used to identify new variants. The policy will take effect January 5th. Now, anyone over the age of 2 will have to provide a negative COVID test prior to departure for the U.S. Joining me now to discuss this is Andy Slavitt, former White House senior advisor for COVID response in the Biden administration. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Nice to be here.
I want to ask you about something that one of your colleagues said in regards to this new policy that's being implemented by the Biden administration, Dr. Michael Osterholm, who told the New York Times, quote, "I understand politically why it must be done, but the bottom line is it's a false sense of security that we're really slowing transmission." Do you agree with Dr. Osterholm, or do you see this as an effective policy?
I love Michael, but this has nothing to do with politics. What's unfolding now in China is a human tragedy that I think we should pause and think about. There are estimated that we're going to lose several 100,000 or more people over the course of this event. And, it's difficult to have a perfect policy response, but I think what the administration is doing is wise. They're effectively saying, because as you pointed out in your opening, we don't have enough information, unlike the rest of the world who shares their genomic data with us, about what is floating around. And because 23,000 Chinese people land from China, not all Chinese people, I should say, of all nationalities, land in the U.S. every day from China. And because we know that in Italy, about half of the people who came from China who tested positive for COVID, it is a prudent thing to do, along with some of the other steps they're taking.
Are you concerned at all, though, that this looks like the United States is somehow punishing China? And I understand the argument about transparency, but why not make it all travelers coming in from a foreign country?
Well, what the White House tells me, as I spoke to them yesterday, is that if China would simply share their genomic data, there may not even be the need for a policy like this. If there's an outbreak in Canada or an outbreak in France, we have really pretty good intelligence that the variants that are occurring there are not concerning to the U.S. And this virus, as we've learned, transforms so frequently that it's not the presence of someone flying from France or even from China with COVID that alarms us the most. What alarms us the most is that with the billions of people in China, the opportunity for a new variant to emerge that we're not aware of that could change things dramatically in the U.S. is higher. And so we've got to reduce the odds of.
Now, would you, given that, like to see other countries implement similar testing protocols for travelers, all travelers coming from China over the age of 2?
Well, every country has to make its own decision, but with the U.S., this go-around was something smart, as it basically said, if your origin destination is China, even if you're flying through, Australia, you still are subject to the testing requirement. So this is, I think, a more reasoned and more thought-out travel test requirement. It's not perfect. I'd like to see it 24 hours instead of 48 hours. And there's no possible way that it's going to stop all travelers coming to the U.S. with COVID, but it's going to reduce it and it'll delay the effect of increased spread here. And I think we can expect here come January that almost no matter what, we're going to see more COVID outbreak.
Yeah, and just about every medical professional with whom I have spoken in recent days agrees with you there. Given that people are gathering for the holidays, they're about to get together for New Year's Eve, given your concerns about the possibility of a new variant, as we are just discussing here, do you think there need to be other mitigation efforts here in the U.S.? In other words, does this announcement about testing protocols from travelers from China, should they be paired with other steps like more masks? I mean, obviously, we encourage masking and the U.S. government encourages masking for traveling. But should there be more mitigation steps put in place?
Well, if you're going to go visit family, particularly people who are older or might otherwise be at risk, it's really wise to test first and mask around them. And for those who don't know, the U.S. government made available more free rapid at-home tests so that you can do that before you go see friends and family for New Year's. But look, these events, regardless of what we'd love to believe in an ideal world, these events are going to have a lot of people around each other in close proximity, hanging out and doing what people do on New Year's Eve and celebrating and getting together. And, that's fine. But I think we all have to understand that not everybody feels that COVID is a little risk to them. Some people feel COVID is actually high risk to them. And we need to be sensitive for those people, even if you're not concerned yourself.
Let me ask you about vaccination rates, because when you look at the booster, it's at 16.8% for all adults for the updated COVID booster. What do you make of that staggeringly low number? And what does the administration need to be doing to reach more people to encourage them to get this booster shot?
It's too low. And I think it's too low for a variety of reasons that you probably would agree with. One is people are just tired of thinking about COVID. Secondly, there is a lot of information out about the vaccines that just isn't true, and it confuses people. And I think it's dangerous. And third, I think people have to appreciate that sometimes a vaccine doesn't prevent you from getting an infection, as we would hope. It prevents you from getting a serious illness or dying. And, a lot of times people will look at that calculation and say, well, if I'm going to get sick, and I'm probably not that worried that I'm going to be seriously ill, then it feels more optional. So I think those numbers need to be higher. I think if there was better, more truthful information and less false information out there, they probably would be higher. But we are really running a little bit uphill in an environment where people just don't want to deal with COVID very much anymore, understandably.
All right. Andy Slavitt, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Hope you have a very happy New Year. Turning now to an update on that massive winter storm. The city of Buffalo has lifted its travel ban, allowing people back on the roads for the first time in days. But the mayor urged drivers to only go out if they have to and to exercise extreme caution, noting there are still hundreds of snow removal vehicles working on the roads. Now, nationwide, there have been at least 78 storm-related deaths from this past week's storm. Half of those, 39, are from Erie County. Meanwhile, after days of disruptions that left thousands of travelers stranded, we've been talking about this all week, Southwest Airlines is now saying normal operations will resume tomorrow. That's after more than 2,300 Southwest flights were canceled today. To help ease the chaos, some other airlines, including American, Delta, and United, have instituted price caps to limit the financial burden on travelers trying to reach their destinations on their airlines. Joining me now to discuss this from Los Angeles International Airport is NBC's Della. So good to see you, Della. Thanks so much for joining us. So, look, Southwest says that it's going to resume normal operations as early as tomorrow, but these travel headaches continue for so many people. Set the scene. What are you hearing? Where are we in this fiasco?
Well, Kristen, there's not so many people here at the Southwest terminal because so many flights have been canceled. But the lucky few that are here that were able to get a flight tell me they're extremely upset and also exhausted from what has been a grueling situation. Behind me, you can see there's a ton of baggage. And at this point, there's more baggage here than people because Southwest flew out baggage while the passengers themselves did not make it. So that has been frustrating for people who have been stranded for days without essential items in there like clothing, medications, and even car seats for kids are here. So a lot of people, although have been loyal to Southwest, they say in the past, they say at this point, they don't know if they'll ever fly Southwest again, despite Southwest saying that it will be resuming operations tomorrow. Take a listen.
I wish them well, and I feel for the employees who have to take all the gruff from the angry passengers, but I think the management team has let everybody down.
I don't believe them, if I'm being honest. I have a really hard time trusting them now. That sounds dramatic, but I don't feel like it's that hard to keep track of bags.
That last woman we spoke to had a unique situation where she got here, but her bags didn't, and she had a cruise. So she went on that cruise with nothing but the clothes on her back. And when she got there, there were so many people, she says, in the same situation that the cruise line, although they usually offer complimentary toiletries, they did not they only offered that at a cost to people because they say they couldn't keep up with all of the demand. So she says while she was on this cruise for about a week, she bought 2 swimsuits and then also a toothbrush, and she says that alone cost her $100, Kristen.
Wow. Well, look, the luggage behind you, the interviews that you have there really tells the tale of what is an ongoing major headache and fiasco for these travelers. Della, thank you so much for your reporting. We really appreciate it. Coming up next, we'll head to Capitol Hill for the political fallout as Congressman-elect George Santos is now under investigation by federal prosecutors from the Eastern District of New York. Plus, we're looking back on 2022's biggest stories in politics and what's ahead in 2023. And speaking of the new year, nowhere in the world celebrates quite like New York City. Here's a look at today's test run as the city prepares to drop 3,000 tons of confetti in Times Square to ring in the new year.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! Oh, it's beautiful! Holy cow, it's a blizzard of confetti.
Welcome back. Congressman-elect George Santos is now facing investigations by federal and local officials. A law enforcement source tells NBC News federal prosecutors from the Eastern District of New York are investigating Santos. That investigation is still in its early stages, and investigators have not focused on any specific allegation of wrongdoing. This source, though, says prosecutors are looking at Santos's finances, including potential irregularities involving financial disclosures, as well as loans Santos made to his campaign. A spokesperson for the Eastern District declined to comment. And as we first reported yesterday, the Nassau County DA is opening an investigation into the numerous fabrications and inconsistencies, that's a quote, in Santos's resume, which she calls, quote, nothing short of stunning. Earlier this week, Santos apologized for, quote, embellishing details of his biography, acknowledging his previous claims about graduating from Baruch College and working for 2 large Wall Street firms were just not true. But he insists that he has not broken the law. NBC News has reached out to George Santos, but has not received a response. Joining me now to discuss this is NBC's Ryan Nobles from Capitol Hill. Ryan, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate it. So this investigation obviously looming large over Republicans as they prepare to take control of the House. What kind of reaction are you hearing?
Well, outside of the newly elected Republican members that serve in districts that are neighboring to George Santos, Republicans in general have been largely silent about this. And those are the Republicans at the highest levels of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives, including Kevin McCarthy, who would like to be the next Speaker of the House, Steve Scalise, who's set to become the Majority Leader, and Elise Stefanik, who still to this day is featured in the banner page on George Santos's Twitter page as someone that's endorsed George Santos's campaign. They've not talked about it. They haven't talked about the fact that if Santos were not to be seated in the seat from the 3rd Congressional District, that it would certainly tighten the margins between Republicans and Democrats, and then potentially not even be a vote for Kevin McCarthy in his bid to become the next Speaker. So this is something they are going to be forced to deal with here, Kristen, in the next 5 days when Congress comes back. But the fact that they're out of town and largely out of pocket has made it so that they've been able to avoid all questions about George Santos.
Boy, it is going to be so interesting when everyone gets back into town, Ryan. Can you talk a little bit about the way in which McCarthy is to some extent boxed in at this moment in terms of his options? What are his options right now?
Well, he really doesn't have any options when it comes to the simple math that exists right now in the House of Representatives. There's just a couple of seats that separate Republicans and Democrats. So from that measure, in order for Republicans to maintain control of the House of Representatives, he needs every single seat he can get. But it becomes even more complicated for him in his bid to become the next Speaker of the House. As you know well, Kristen, the Speaker of the House is voted on by both Republicans and Democrats, and there are certainly more Republicans than there are Democrats, but there is a faction of Republicans from the Conservative Freedom Caucus and others who have said they are not going to vote for Kevin McCarthy as Speaker. So because those margins are so tight, McCarthy's in danger of not winning the speakership, and George Santos has already publicly said that he would support Kevin McCarthy for Speaker. He needs to bank that vote. He can't afford to let it go. Now, the question becomes, does he let someone like Santos take his seat next week and then deal with it afterwards, after all those votes are settled and the dust moves on? That's still an open question. But right now, these investigations are going to take a long time to run its course. And outside of Santos deciding to resign or not be seated on his own, there isn't much that leaders in Congress can do.
Yeah, and Santos is showing no signs of backing down. Very quickly, Ryan, before I let you go, I know you're tracking another story, the January 6th committee pulling its subpoena of former President Donald Trump. What can you tell us about that?
It's really just a logistical move on behalf of the committee. They're obviously done with their final report. They're going to dissolve at the end of the year. There was a pending lawsuit that was filed by representatives for Donald Trump to try and prevent that subpoena from happening. This is Benny Thompson saying we don't have to worry about that anymore. We're withdrawing the subpoena because our work is over. Doesn't mean they don't think that Donald Trump should have answered that subpoena, but it's not something that's going to be litigated going into the future.
All right. Well, you've got a busy 2023 coming up, my friend, on Capitol Hill. So great to see you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kristen.
Well, this final week of the year is a great opportunity to reflect on the events that shaped 2022 and look ahead at how they'll impact 2023. So recently, Chuck, Garrett Hake, and I sat down to look back at the year in politics.
Well, as 2022 draws to an end, we'd like to look back at a year that saw a historic midterm election and early entrance into the 2024 presidential election, which just happens to be a former president of the United States. The Republicans regained the House barely. Democrats retained the Senate. And once again, a special counsel was appointed to take a closer look at Donald Trump. Deja vu all over again. America watched, though, as January 6th committee presented its findings, and the world watched as Russia invaded Ukraine. So joining me to discuss what it all means for the year ahead is our chief White House correspondent, Kristen Welker, and our senior Capitol Hill correspondent, Garrett Hake. Obviously, with the midterms being over, and the fact that the midterms weren't decisive, all they did was essentially prove to us we're just as divided as we were before. We're in the middle of this trench warfare. We spent $6 billion to move 1 Senate seat and 10 House seats, so here we are. All of it was a prelude to 24, which is essentially, is the Biden re-elect already begun?
It is effectively already begun. Chuck, the president said he intends to run. He's going to make an official decision in the new year after huddling with his family over the holidays. But look, I can tell you in talking to folks who are close to him, he's ending this year feeling emboldened because he got a lot of legislation passed. I think the most important thing as it relates to the president's potential re-election campaign is the economy. Gas prices ending the year at their lowest level than they've been in a year. Yeah. Having said that, there is still so much unknown as we head into the new year. What will inflation look like as we get closer to 2024? I think that's going to be a big question.
You know, in your beat, Garrett, There's actually a massive change, okay? No Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah.
Okay, forget everything else. Yes, it's still a narrow majority. No Nancy Pelosi. That's a seismic change.
I've never known a Congress without Nancy Pelosi in a leadership role. Look, I mean, this last Congress, for all the time we spent talking about stuff not moving, whether it was the Build Back Better or the various, component pieces of that, a failure to change the rules in the Senate, was historically productive. I mean, I've covered a number of Congresses now, and this is the one that's gotten the most done ever. And so much of that falls to Nancy Pelosi. And so the kind of strength she was able to do behind the scenes with a very narrow majority. If Kevin McCarthy had been taking notes, they will be of great use to him now, because it's a very specific skill set to kind of like rally your party in that way every single day.
A year ago at this time, there was concern that there was going to be a war in Europe, but there was still some hope that it would be prevented. Turned out to be arguably the dominant story of the globe. In this country next year, the one story that I think we're both anticipating but not fully prepared for is the trial of Donald John Trump, right? If there is an indictment, there's going to be a trial. And that, I don't know if everybody is fully ready to realize what that's going to look like.
There is no doubt that if that were to happen, that would upend the entire political universe. And if you talk to legal experts, they agree on one thing, that this former president faces more legal jeopardy than perhaps any other president in U.S. history. And so I think that it would certainly be a diversion from all of these other headlines that we are discussing, the work of Congress, the work of the White House, and the economy, as well as the war in Ukraine.
Chuck, you said trial singular. It could be, and we're talking, we could say indictments plural here. That's what the federal investigation that the special counsel has been running on two different things, right? On the Mar-a-Lago documents piece and on the January 6th piece. But there's also that investigation down in Georgia where a lot of legal experts have said they think he's in more legal jeopardy potentially in Georgia than he is at the federal level.
We know, what we do know is going to be nuts in 2023. It's some of these things that we don't know that I think are even more unusual. And that's why you just got to stick around and watch all of us do our jobs here at NBC News. Kristen and Garrett, enjoy the new year.
Thanks.
Thanks, Chuck.
Enjoyed that conversation with those guys. All right, after the break, Gen Z's growing electoral power, how the youngest voting bloc could soon become one of the most important. That's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. 2022 may be remembered as the year Gen Z voters first made their voices heard on the political stage. According to our NBC News exit poll, about 1 in every 8 ballots cast this November was by a voter under 30, and that group includes a lot of Gen Z voters. Looking ahead to 2024, the influence of Gen Z voters is likely to become more pronounced, with more members of Gen Z turning 18 each day and more young registered voters primed to come off the sidelines. According to a new poll from Social Sphere, 45% of registered Gen Z voters say they voted in the 2022 midterms. And of the registered voters who did not cast a ballot, more than a third say they regret their decision not to turn out, which is very interesting. Now, very soon, Gen Z voters could be a force that makes or breaks elections. Joining me now to discuss this and to discuss the future of Gen Z voters is John Della Volpe. He is the director of polling at the Harvard Institute of Politics and an NBC News contributor. John, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So let's break down your latest poll. What did it tell you about Gen Z voters and their power and impact on elections?
Well, thanks, Kristen. What it showed is actually for the third election cycle since Gen Z had their kind of mature enough to vote in 2018, 2020, in this election cycle, they made a significant difference. I argue that it was their energy that actually blocked the red wave. When we talk about 18 to 29-year-old voters, the youth vote, as you said, about half of them, a little bit more than half of them would be part of Gen Z. And they voted overwhelmingly for Democrats on a national basis, but also in several of those swing states and those key states, voting over 70%, according to exit polls, for John Fetterman, over 70% for Mark Kelly as well. This is a generation that's voting to defend themselves, their generation, but also, I think, to defend democracy.
It's so fascinating. And among Gen Z voters who voted in 2022, what they say mattered most to them in this election was abortion and women's rights. So I guess the question is, did these voters show up in 2022, do you think, because Roe v. Wade was overturned? How much of an energizing factor was that?
It was clearly a significant, I think, catalyst, Kristen. But the Harvard poll that we released in March, that we conducted in March, we released in April of this year, showed that even before the Dobbs decision was leaked, young people were highly engaged in voting. I think clearly taking away that right that so many Americans had assumed will never be taken away. It's been a right for 50 years or so. Clearly, that was a catalyst. But also, I think a key part of this election is the support that young people saw in their voice being heard by the Democratic administration, by Joe Biden, by Democratic Congress, delivering on the promises that they made to young voters just a couple of years ago. I think the combination of the Dobbs decision as well as a positive record from Washington, those two things, I think, made a difference.
John, given everything that you have seen in these polls, do you expect, and do the tea leaves suggest that Gen Z voters are going to not only stay engaged, but potentially become more engaged, more enthusiastic about getting out, polling, and voting, I should say?
Yeah, we've seen, we've been studying young voters for over 20 years now at the Institute of Politics. We've seen spikes in the past, pre and post 2001, the 9/11, pre and post Obama 2008. But this has been sustained, Kristen, for 3 cycles in a row. And the combination of Gen Z and millennials together, that's going to account for 40% of votes in the next cycle in 2024. So this is 2 generations now with shared values who overwhelmingly have been supporting Democrats in the last 3 elections. It's going to be a difference maker again, I think, in 24.
I want to ask you about some other findings in the poll, which is that effectively, if you looked at all Gen Zers, the top 3 issues that they said they cared most about: the environment, guns, and education. These are not exactly issues that are typically energizing for senior voters, for older voters. Do you think that we're going to actually see a shift in messaging for candidates, including presidential candidates?
They should be both messaging, but also based upon values. And what those 3, I think, individual issues, basically comprise is a sense of young people being concerned about their individual rights and freedoms, individual right and freedom to breathe clean air, right? To be safe, physically safe when they enter a school, and for everyone to have access to quality education, K through 12 as well as college. So those are individual rights, and the framing, I think, is less about messaging. It's more about those values. And that's how you connect to this generation. That question was based not on what you're voting about today, but what kind of America do you want to see? What are the issues critically important for America to being, the place that it can and should be?
And John, just finally, of course, you have Maxwell Frost, the first Gen Zer who's going to Congress. Do you think he is going to be the first of many that we are going to now see enter politics?
I do. And I think one of the differences, it's hard to measure, but one of the differences I see, qualitatively between this generation and millennials is the urgency and the interest in participating by all means that they can. Some for Maxwell, it's elected office. For others, it's voting at rates that my generation, Gen X, and baby boomers never voted when we were their age. So I think by all means necessary, that's the urgency they see in politics. And I applaud anyone who puts their name out there on a ballot to serve their community and their country.
Oh, I will second you in that. John Della Volpe, really fascinating findings. Thank you so much. A very happy New Year to you. Appreciate your joining us. Same to you. Coming up next, the far-reaching consequences of the Taliban's latest crackdowns on women's rights in Afghanistan. But before we go to break, we do have some sad news to report from the world of sports. Brazilian soccer legend Pelé has died. His daughter confirmed today that he passed away after a year-long battle with cancer. Pelé is considered among the greatest soccer players of all time, leading Brazil to 3 World Cup titles in 1958, 1962, and 1970. He eventually helped build soccer's popularity in the United States, playing for the New York Cosmos in the 1970s. In addition to his success on the field, Pelé also served as Brazil's extraordinary minister for sports and was an ambassador for the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Pelé was 82 years old. Welcome back. The United Nations announced yesterday it has been forced to halt some of its aid programs in Afghanistan in response to the Taliban's decision last week to ban women from working in NGO aid. This comes as 4 major aid organizations, including IRC and CARE, suspend operations in Afghanistan earlier this week. The UN joined aid groups in condemning the ban again today, saying female staff have access to populations that their male colleagues cannot reach and are critical to safeguarding the communities we serve. They save lives. Their professional expertise is indispensable. Their participation in aid delivery is not negotiable and must continue. This ban is the second time the Taliban has moved to limit women's rights in the last 10 days, banning women from attending universities earlier last week. Women students in Afghanistan are protesting the ban, some even burning pictures of the Taliban and Taliban leaders. I'm joined now by Atiya Bawi, author of The Secret Sky and former NBC News foreign correspondent. So good to see you. Thank you for being here, Atiya.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, if you could just give us your reaction to this latest ban by the Taliban not allowing women to serve on NGOs and then the counter response from the UN.
I mean, it's one gut punch after another, especially if you're an Afghan woman. Definitely if you're an Afghan, but especially if you're an Afghan woman. First, banning education for secondary schools, now going to the universities. We saw this coming. It's no surprise that this came along. Everyone was hoping for this Taliban 2.0, but anyone who really knows the Taliban knew this was a step-by-step process. This is their lust for control and power. And how do you do that? You do that by subjugating half of the society and giving the other half some semblance of power over women. It goes back to the age-old adage as well when you think of education. You educate a man, you educate a person, you educate a woman, you educate a family. The Taliban do not want educated families throughout Afghanistan. Education means that there are going to be people who understand their rights, their human rights, and their rights in Islam. The Taliban claim to be students of Islam, the students of God. But in Islam, it's not just a right to be educated. It's an obligation for both men and women to be educated. The Quran itself says that because they want the Afghan people, they want Muslims to be educated and know their rights and how to interpret the Quran and to understand the word of God. So this goes against Islam itself, but it's a way for the Taliban to continue to maintain control.
You know, I wonder what you think the impact will be of the UN and the 4 big NGOs pulling out of Afghanistan. What is the broader impact going to be for the people of Afghanistan? Obviously, it sends a very strong message to the Taliban, but there's going to be a ripple effect.
100%. And I spoke to Afghan friends today on the phone, asking them how they felt about this. And really, the impact is going to first and foremost be towards the Afghan people. We're heading into these harsh winter months. Kabul, the capital, just had its first major snowfall today. Provinces throughout the country are going to be shut off from aid in general, let alone aid that's trying to get to them. People are going to die. Men, women, and children are going to die. They will be the victims of this. The Taliban themselves, they're living comfortably in their mansions in Kabul and their nice houses in Kandahar, even across the border in Pakistan. They're not going to be the ones affected by this. It's the average everyday Afghans. And when I spoke to the Afghans that I spoke to today, they knew that it was going to be them that will continue to suffer. They're not happy that the aid organizations have to halt their services, but they also understand why. But they were hoping that it wouldn't come to this.
Atiya, just finally, as we showed there, some Afghan women are already protesting, and undoubtedly there will be some Taliban who try to crack down on those protesters. What are your biggest concerns when you see these protesters? What are your hopes? What do you hope the U.S. government sees and does?
They're already cracking down. They're already beating these women. They're attacking them. And I know in just a few weeks' time, I'll be seeing them on Afghan television forcing to confess that they were forced by Western governments to protest, as I've seen in the past, that they've portrayed it as. My hope is that the world will continue to listen, to continue to watch. I think that's what every Afghan that I've spoken to, that's what their hope is, because they know what it's like to be forgotten. And the last time they were forgotten, they were massacred through a civil war. which led to the Taliban 1.0, as we saw. And they're hoping that you won't forget them. That's their number one hope. And eventually there will be some kind of help.
We hope so. Atiya Bawi, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you for being with us this hour. We will be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues ahead.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.